we'll go ahead and get started. I'm Cornell Clayton, Director of the Foley Institute, and let me welcome you out to our event today. This is the last in our series this semester on the 2024 election. And we're fortunate to have someone who's perfect to sum up what happened in terms of American democracy and political polarization. Samara Klar is a professor of political science at the University of Arizona, where she's also the co-coordinator of the Arizona Policy Lab. She's published widely in leading journals and academic journals such as the American Political Science Review, the American Journal of Political Science, Nature, the Journal of Politics, and the Journal Science. She is also published in mainstream outlets such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, and CNN.com. Her most recent book, Partisan Hostility in American Democracy, was published by the University of Chicago Press in 2024. She was also the co-author of Independent Politics, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2016, and which received 3 different national book awards from the American Political Science Association. In 2016, Samara started the website Women Also Know Stuff, which promotes women in political science and now features over 2,000 independent scholars who are experts in their fields, and which has inspired spin-offs, sites from different disciplines and countries all over the world. So join me now in welcoming Samara Klar to the Foley Institute.
Okay, thank you so much for being here and for inviting me. This is my first time in Palmet, and it's absolutely beautiful. I've had some time to drive around. I drove to Idaho this morning. It's right there. I've done doing a whole tour. It's really amazing to be here, so thank you very much. When I was invited to come speak, I was given sort of a real broad mandate over what I should be talking about. The election, and maybe my research, or maybe what happened, or maybe democracy, whatever I want. So I decided what I'm going to do today is I want to review some of the work that I've done, some of which you very kindly mentioned. And I want to try to talk about how some of the work I've been doing really over the last 10 years or so can help us understand democracy today, and even what happened maybe in the election, whatever that was, 100 years ago I think it happened. I don't remember. It feels like a long time now. So I'm going to cover a lot of stuff. We always tell students, especially grad students, if there's grad students here, when you give a talk, never try to cover more than one article. But I'm going to talk about 2 books in an article, so this is going to be bad, and I will never do what I'm doing. I want to start by talking about sort of just what I'm going to go through today. So how we got here and where we are is kind of the goal for this talk. I'm going to start by talking about partisanship in America. Partisanship is something I've studied since I did my PhD almost, I don't remember now, 15 years ago. I'm going to talk about polarization specifically and some of the consequences that polarization is having on how we vote and how we think about politics. And then I will finally end with some comments on the 2024 election. And hopefully we can maybe have some discussion about that. So we are very polarized. Partisanship is driving everything we're doing and everything we're thinking. But at the same time, I think we maybe all know this, most Americans are not partisans at all. Independent is the most popular political affiliation in America. And there's something almost paradoxical about that because we are living in a very polarized era where Democrats and Republicans are so divided and the electorate is so divided and we're so driven by partisanship. But if you look at this graph, what you can see is in the dashed line there is the percentage of Americans who identify as independent over time from 1990 until the data goes until 2023. The blue line are Democrats, the red line are Republicans. So you see both Democrats and Republicans inching slowly downwards while independents take over. Now, these are independents who include what we would call leaners. So for those who don't know, when we ask people about partisanship, we say, are you a Democrat, are you a Republican, are you an independent? If you say you're an independent, we'll say, is there a party that you prefer? We tend to call those independents leaners. But nevertheless, leaners are people who don't want to identify as a Democrat or Republican. So why are so many people identifying as independent? I want to start by talking about that before I turn to sort of consequences for how we think about politics. So I did write a book on independent voters almost 10 years ago now, but I want to just cover a couple of the main takeaways from that before we get into this. My co-author, Yana Krupnikov, and I asked a large sample of respondents if you were to try to give off the best impression in a group of strangers, would you say you're a Democrat, a Republican, or an independent? And this is what our respondents told us. 60% of respondents told us to give off the best impression, you should say you're an independent. Now, they specifically said an independent that prefers a party, but an independent. Only 15% said that a partisan would give off the best impression. And when we asked them, well, which one would get off the worst impression? You can see a unanimous choice among both Democrats and Republicans. There was no asymmetry here. Both Democrats and Republicans viewed the Democrat and Republican labels as the least desirable option. And we know that there is a stigma against partisanship. And throughout the book that we did on independence, we really pushed people to try to understand how bad is this stigma. So I want to show you just one of my favorite studies that we did in this book, only because I think it's really funny. We showed a sample of respondents, a picture of this guy. That is my husband. I'm just joking. That is a computer-generated image. That's not a real person. There is a computer software program where you can ask to provide a face, and you can tell the computer program you want the face to be high or low or average and all sorts of qualities. And we just asked for an average face. So that is apparently what an average face looks like. If you look like that, now you know you're average. I don't know. But we got that face. That was our face for this study. And what we did with our sample of respondents is we asked half of our sample to read an article about Democrats and Republicans working together in Washington. And we asked the other half of the sample to read an article about Democrats and Republicans fighting in Washington. We then asked them, how attractive, likable, competent, and trustworthy is this face? So I'm going to show you the percent of people first who rate this face attractive, likable, competent, and trustworthy. And you can see, we told everyone this face was an independent. This is a political independent. So we gave a little bit of information about this average guy. One of the pieces of information our respondents have is that he's an independent voter. After reading about partisan unity, you could see, that's the yellow bar. You could see about 15% of people rated him physically attractive. But after reading about Democrats and Republicans fighting in Washington, almost 30% of the sample found this independent voter to be physically attractive. We also found that this independent voter is rated as more likable, substantially more competent, and slightly more trustworthy after reading about partisan disagreement. So when we read about Democrats and Republicans fighting, which is mostly all we read about, to be honest, we find independent voters better, more attractive on all of these dimensions. And we know that intuitively, that if you go to a dinner party, you go to a party, you don't know anybody, and strangers ask you about your political views, you know that you kind of want to say you're independent. It's very uncomfortable to say your partisanship. And I always tell my undergrads, why? Why is that something that we have to hide? You can say where you're from, you can say your hobbies, but there's something very personal about revealing the party you vote for. It is so part of your social identity, and there's a stigma against identifying really with either side. Sometimes it does seem like everybody absolutely hates the out party. So I want to show you, this is not my data. This is data that came from Shanto Iyengar and colleagues over at Stanford. They did a study that got a lot of attention where they asked people, would you be happy or unhappy if your child married a member of the other party and a member of your own party? So they're trying to figure out how much more unhappy people would be if their child married somebody from the other party. So what they find, this was the big result in their paper, that there's this big increase in the proportion of people who say they would be unhappy if their child married somebody from the other party. This got lots of attention. And my co-author, Yana Kubnikov, and our other co-author, John Ryan, and I really didn't like this study. We've talked to the authors about it a lot. We're friends with them, so don't worry. But we're still friends. We're still friends. Well, we cite them a lot when we criticize their paper, so they like that. But we didn't like this study particularly because all the information you get about your child's spouse is their partisanship. And that's a very strange situation to be in, to say, okay, first imagine you have a child, which you might not even have. Next, imagine this child's getting married. It's like, oh my God, wow, I just met this fake child, now they're getting married. And the only thing you know about their spouse is their partisanship. What kind of world does that what is that? You never would introduce your significant other to your parents and say, this is my boyfriend, he's a Republican. It's a very strange situation. So we decided to redo this experiment, and we added a bunch of other conditions. So in our new experiment, we redid exactly what these guys did, but we said, imagine your child is marrying either a Democrat who talks about politics a lot, a Democrat who rarely talks about politics, or a Republican who talks about politics a lot, or a Republican who rarely talks about politics. And what we found is that people don't actually care who their child marries as long as they don't talk about politics. When you tell someone that your new hypothetical in-law is a partisan, you are rightfully assuming this person must be really interested in politics because the only thing you know about them is their partisanship. But in fact, the talks rarely condition, which is all the way out of the side, this shows how relatively happy or unhappy Republicans in red and Democrats would be. So this is how much they would prefer that their child marry an in-party member over an out-party member. You can see that in the control group, they're substantially happier to have their child marry an out-party member. An in-party member. And what's particularly fascinating is the control group doesn't differ from the talks frequently group, which suggests that in the control group, they're assuming this person talks frequently. It's only in the talks rarely group where you see people actually don't really care. And in fact, I didn't include this graph for the sake of time, people don't even want you to marry an in-party member who talks about politics. Even that idea, have your child marrying somebody from your own party who talks a lot about politics, they're like, no thank you, we do not need that even though we agree. So Americans hate partisanship. They don't hate people. That's the first point I wanted to make in this talk. We don't really hate people. We don't hate voters who vote for other people. We all know voters who vote for the other party. Maybe they're not your best friends, but you don't hate them, and that's pretty normal for Americans. But it is nevertheless the case that the out party does drive animus. So what I'm showing you here is a very common way of measuring what we call affective polarization. Affective polarization is the degree to which you personally like your own party more than the other party. So we usually do this with what we call a thermometer scale that goes from 0 to 100. Where we're saying, okay, on this thermometer scale, 100 means very warm, 0 means very cold. How do you feel about Democrats and how do you feel about Republicans? So maybe, it's normal to like your own party more. It would kind of be weird to like the other party more, but maybe you're like a 65 for your own party and like a 45 for the other party. That's not a particularly polarized individual. Some people, though, rate their own parties as 95 and the other party as 0. That's a highly affectively polarized person. That is a person with a strong preference for the other party. For their own party. So what I'm showing you over here is over time, how people have rated their own party in red and the other party in blue. And first what I would point out is affective polarization is obviously growing because affective polarization is that gap between your own party and the other party. But it's really primarily, I would say actually exclusively driven by animus or negative feelings toward the other party. We don't see Americans increasingly liking their own party. In fact, there is actually a slight decline. It's sort of imperceptible in this graph. But if anything, we feel the same about our own party that we always have. We just really hate the other party. That is what is driving affective polarization. So the next findings that I wanted to review with you before we get to what this all means has to do with what this actually means for policy preferences. We've known this for a couple of decades now, that affective polarization is growing. But affective polarization, does it actually change what we think about politics? So I want to talk about another study that I did. This was with a lot of co-authors, Matt Lewandowski, who I think was here somewhat recently, Jamie Druckman and Yana Krupnikov and John Ryan. The 5 of us did this huge study together, which turned into a book, where we interviewed the same panel of respondents 4 times over the course of 2 years. So it was a 4-wave survey. And what we did is we measured at time 1 how much people hate the other party. Because we wanted to see whether hating the other party actually changes the way you think about policies. But we didn't want to ask people about affective polarization and policy views at the same time because those two things could be influencing each other. So in July of 2019, we measured animosity toward both the in-party and the out-party. We were like, this is going to be great. We're going to have 4 productive years. What could go wrong? We're gonna have childcare. We're gonna be able to travel. Obviously, the pandemic then hit. So we slowed down our study a little bit. But in April of 2020, we resurveyed everybody at the onset of the pandemic. In October of 2020, we resurveyed everyone again right before the 2020 election. And in April of 2021, we resurveyed everybody one last time, and this was just in the this was a few months into the Biden presidency. So we ended up with about 2,000 people at the end of this big panel. Lots of stuff happened over the course of those 2 years. It was crazy. There was constantly things going on. There was impeachments, there was protests, there was elections, there was another impeachment, lots of things happened. So what we were able to do was measure how people thought about all of these issues and look to see whether their affective polarization levels were influencing their policy preferences. So first, what we're going to do here is I want to distinguish between issues that were politicized by party leaders and issues that weren't. Because our theory is that when party leaders politicize an issue, affective polarized respondents are going to follow their cues. When party leaders do not politicize an issue, then affectively polarized respondents are going to look like any other respondents. The key in this study is that we believe hating the other party makes you more likely to follow whatever policies your party leader puts out. It kind of turns you a little bit into a bit of a partisan lemming. Affective polarization makes you follow party cues. So we found a few politicized issues and a few non-politicized ones. So the ones I'm going to focus on are things like immigration, which was heavily politicized by party leaders, healthcare, national political figures, mask wearing late in the pandemic, not early in the pandemic. Things that were not politicized were things like campaign finance laws. People have a really hard time distinguishing how Republicans versus Democrats feel about them. Local political figures tend to be not particularly politicized. And mask wearing early in the pandemic. Remember when the Surgeon General was like, don't wear masks? Does anyone remember that? It was like very early. So that was when they were not politicized. Our expectation is that as out-party animus grows, we should see a gap between how politicized, affectively polarized, and non-affectively polarized people become. So let's start with April 2020. This was the don't wear masks era where nobody really knew what to do. It was like mass confusion. The CDC had recommended masks, but partisan leaders had not yet weighed in. We were all trying to understand what to make of the pandemic and what we were supposed to be doing. And what I want to show you here is the black line is Democrats in our sample. The gray line are the Republicans in our sample. This is April of 2020. This x-axis, is this where? Maybe a little bit. The x-axis is showing you on the left side people who don't hate the other party. And on the right side is as hatred toward the other party, as out-party animus increases. So all the way on the left are the people who prefer their own party by very small amounts, and all the way on the right are people who prefer the other party by a lot. And as you can see, in April of 2020, as out-party animus grows, attitudes among Democrats and Republicans doesn't change. Democrats are always more in favor of wearing masks than Republicans, but it doesn't depend on their level of out-party animosity. Whether you like the other party or hate them, your views on masks are basically the same. But then what happens in October of 2020 is we see party leaders take a very strong stance on this. Democratic leaders wearing masks on the House floor, Republican leaders arguing against mask laws, strongly showing their opposition to masks, and we start to see this very divergent pattern. On the left side of the x-axis are the Democrats and Republicans in the dashed lines who don't hate the other party. And for Democrats and Republicans who don't hate the other party, they actually kind of agree on masks. There's not much of a difference there. But as out-party animus grows, as you move rightward along the x-axis, you see Republicans in particular, Democrats are so high there's a bit of a ceiling effect here, Republicans start going dramatically downward. Meaning, for Republicans in particular, and I can show you a few other examples that are a little less asymmetric, out-party animus drives opposition to mask wearing. The more you hate the other party, the less you want to wear a mask. Meaning, your views on masks, a public health crisis, is increasingly being driven by how much you dislike the other party. In April 2021, which is, sorry, this one. You can see we just found a replication again. The polarization of the mask issue was still high, and you can still see Democrats and Republicans increasingly diverging their views based on their out-party animus. We found the same pattern among COVID attitudes and behaviors. So this is support for COVID-related policies, specifically business closures, whether businesses should be closed in order to prevent spread of COVID. In April 2020, party leaders had not taken a stance on this. No one really knew what to think. Regardless of out-party animus, Democrats and Republicans were the same. They agreed on it. Those who hated the out-party, those who didn't hate the out-party, we don't see much divergence. You can see here, this is in October 2020 and April 2021, so after this issue has been politicized, the more that people hate the out-party, the more they disagree with each other on whether businesses should close to prevent the spread of a pandemic, which seems so non-political, but becomes highly political. Now, what's somewhat comforting to me, and I am an optimist, I always try to look for the good news, if you look to the left side, the left half of the x-axis, Democrats and Republicans really do largely agree on this. And I will say that a large percent of Americans are on that left side. It is not a majority of Americans who hate the other party. In fact, it's probably slightly less than half of Americans express strong animus toward the other party. And it's only among the out-party haters that you see this strong divergence. I'm just going to give a few non-COVID examples. This is, should the minimum wage be increased to $15? As Democrats and Republicans increasingly hate each other, they increasingly diverge their views on this. So a Democrat who hates Republicans really wants the minimum wage to go up, and the Republicans who hate Democrats really don't want it to go up. How does that make sense? I don't know. It's only that hating the other party makes you follow the cues of your leader. The Affordable Care Act. Among Democrats and Republicans who don't hate out partisans, there's actually quite a bit of agreement. It's only among those who are highly affectively polarized where we see that big change. Should undocumented immigrants have a pathway to citizenship? High levels of agreement among Democrats and Republicans who are not affectively polarized. Huge divergence among those highest in out-party animus. And as I said, I want to show you a few non-political examples. We asked whether Congresspeople should be banned from becoming lobbyists when they first leave Congress, which is a policy that is very, very difficult to disentangle between Democrats and Republicans. There's no clear party line on this one. Democrats and Republicans agree regardless of affective polarization. Without clear party cues, we don't see that gap. Another example is eliminating the cap on political donations. No clear party leader cues on that one, and we don't see any difference. So overall, we find extensive evidence across attitudes relating to both policies and politicians that partisans vary in their animosity that they hold toward the out party, and that animosity determines how much they follow party leaders' cues. So if you know somebody, or maybe are somebody, who's deeply polarized, hates the other party, you might find that your policy views are fairly connected to the views expressed by your party leaders. Among those high and out party bias, party graphs grow considerably as partisans follow cues. A third thing I want to show you is that partisan identity is very, very hard to overshadow with other identities. And here's a study that I think speaks also directly to the election, and I'll bring it all together in a second, about why we're not finding partisans coming together over common identities. So we know at this point, partisanship is driving people's views when there's out-party animus, but there are theories that when partisans share a common identity, maybe we can bring those party groups together. And in the particular case of this election, I've now been seeing lots of speculation and curiosity as to why Kamala Harris, as the first woman president, would not have brought together at least women from both parties who you could unite over that shared goal. So I'm going to show you a little data, and there's not a lot of optimism from this one, on why we did not see that happen in this election and should not expect to see that happen probably ever. Female candidates often inspire this hope that sharing a gender identity will bridge competing partisan gaps. So we saw it with Hillary Clinton, which you may or may not remember at this point. Women's crossover votes for Clinton will surprise the GOP. That did not happen. We saw this with Sarah Palin. Clinton backers by her side. Palin makes a pitch to women voters. That did not happen. And then, of course, to Harris in 2024, a lot of women are rising up. Harris hopes hinge on female vote. None of that happened, as I'll show you. But there is social psychological work to suggest that maybe it should. Social psychology says that a superordinate identity should bring partisans together. Rival groups who share a common identity can often find a common goal to work toward. And experimental political science research, Matt Lewandowski actually has done some work showing that when Democrats and Republicans think about being Americans, it can bring them together. But as I already ruined the spoiler, Hillary Clinton lost. She only got 51% of the vote. Palin certainly did not get a lot of women voting for her who would have otherwise voted for Republicans. Republican women continue to vote for Republicans. And Harris, at this point, looks like has received fewer votes from women than Biden did in 2020, although I will say all the Harris stuff, the Trump-Harris data is still somewhat preliminary as we're still counting votes, especially in my state of Arizona. But it looks as though Harris did not, especially among white women is what I wanted to say. Harris did not lure the women voters either. So why not? A closer look at this classic work on shared identities suggests that in order for a common identity to bring rival groups together, the groups need to agree on what it means to be part of that identity. And Democratic women and Republican women hold very distinct views of womanhood, and in particular of feminism. So this is some survey data I did, I don't even remember how long ago this was, maybe 6 years ago. This is a really big sample. There's like 2,500 women nationally. And I asked them, how well does the term feminist describe you? How well does the term feminist describe the average Democrat? The average Democratic woman? And how well does feminist describe the average Republican woman? Two interesting things in this graph. The first is that Democrats and Republicans are dramatically far apart from each other. So you can see, here we go. So it is. So how well does the term feminist describe you? So for Democratic women, they're down here. They're just between very well and somewhat well. For Republicans, they are up here at not very well. So we see a big gap. Republican women do not identify as feminists. Democratic women do. In fact, Democratic men identify as feminists at dramatically higher rates than Republican women. And then here, this part I love. It's so interesting to me. When they say how well does the term feminist describe the out partisan, they're like dead on. Like it's very good guessing. You can see that Democrats guess Republicans to be like right where they are. And then Republicans also, they're very good at it. I really, we see a lot of studies on sort of misperceptions, but there are some areas where Democrats and Republicans are very good at understanding each other. So there's a big gap here between Democratic and Republican women. So with an experiment, and this is the last study I'm going to show you before we get to the election, I tested how women react to other women from the other party when gender is made salient or not. So this was a study I did quite a while ago. It was when Obama was president. Because of the reviewer's request, I then replicated it again when Trump was president, and everything holds, but I'm not going to show you both versions. So I asked about two issues. The first was called the Lilly Ledbetter Equal Pay Act, which some of you might be familiar with. It was signed into law by Barack Obama, and it simply extends the statute of limitations that a woman can, for a woman to file an equal pay lawsuit. So it gives women longer periods of time to sue their employer if they feel that they were discriminated against based on their gender. And then I asked about the Iran deal, not at all a gender-related issue. It had to do with imposing restrictions on Iran's uranium and centrifuges. So totally unrelated to gender. So I presented information to my study regarding both of these issues in a set of news articles. And this is a very classic political science experiment idea. You basically experimentally manipulate whether the person your respondents are reading about is either a man or a woman. It was pioneered by Virginia Sapiro in 1981, and it's a very common way to do it. So I have four versions. I have a Republican and a Democrat, and I have a male and a female. So this is just an example of what they read. This was a fake article I made in a very sophisticated graphic software called Paint. I don't know if you guys have access to that on this campus. Paint is my best friend. This is from Paint. So this is a local Republican man supporting the Fair Pay Act. And then this would be the local Republican woman supporting the Fair Pay Act. And then I had them for the Iran deal as well. So it's just, is it a Republican, is it a Democrat, is it a man or a woman? And then the question in my dependent variable was just, how trustworthy is this person? And so I said, from what you read today, how much do you trust Lewis or Linda Walsh on this issue? Because the characters were either named Lewis. So here's local Republican woman, Linda Walsh, supports the Republican Party, speaking out in support of the law. So what I found is that when evaluating co-partisans, so people from your own party, Republican women prefer women who support the Lilly Ledbetter Act over men. Republican women prefer a Republican woman who supports the Lilly Ledbetter Act over a man. When evaluating Democrats, however, Republican women prefer the men who support the Lilly Ledbetter Act over the women. So when the gender is salient, Republican women, and don't worry, Democratic women are just as bad. I will get to them in just a second. Republican women favor men from the other party over women from the other party when they agree on a gender salient issue. So women are more penalized than men for being in the opposing party. Within their own party, Democratic women do the same kind of nonsense. They prefer women who support men if they're co-partisans. But when judging Republicans, Democratic women prefer men who support the Lilly Ledbetter Act. So we find that Democratic women are also penalizing Republican women over men when gender is being made salient. They're thinking of gender when they look at this issue, and then they're being asked to think about a Republican man or a Republican woman, and the one they don't trust is the Republican woman. However, when the issue does not make gender salient, the Iran deal, this pattern goes away for Republican women. When gender is not salient, both men and women face the same penalty for being from the out party. They do not discriminate based on gender, and Democrats do the exact same thing. When the issue has nothing to do with gender, they equally dislike an out party man and an out party woman. So sharing a gender identity does not unify female partisan opponents. If anything, it divides them. A gender salient issue decreases trust between women from either party. And when gender is not salient, the effect goes away. Men receive a bonus in perceived trustworthiness from women in the opposing party. So we should not expect for Republican women to reach out across the aisle and support Kamala Harris, which they didn't, nor should we expect Democratic women to support Republican female candidates. And I've had to say this to several friends and colleagues who are, frankly, Democrats, who are surprised that Republican women aren't voting for her. And I say, well, did you vote for the Republican woman who was running? And they're like, oh my God, of course not. It's the same phenomenon. Gender is not only irrelevant to the decision making, but it actually creates penalties when people view the opposing party as having a different conception of what it means to be part of this identity group. So I'm going to wrap up by getting to the 2024 election, which just happened, as you may know. Some implications directly from this research. First, Americans dislike and distrust partisan politics. Negativity is driving affective polarization, and that is increasing our reliance on party cues. And we are seeing this in a lot of we were just talking about some of the shifts that we see in Republicans and Democrats in terms of when it comes to issues that were typically not associated with those parties. But we see how party leaders, and a lot of this goes back to some great work Gabe Lenz did like 20 years ago, called Follow the Leader, on how much people will follow the cues set out by their party leaders. I think our contribution probably to what Gabe Lenz already showed is that we show this is heavily dependent on how much you hate the other party. And I really, my undergraduate class is 50% Democrat, 50% Republican. I polled them at the beginning of the semester, and it's anonymous. I don't make them like publicly identify themselves or anything. And the one thing I really want them to get out of my class is to try to not hate the other party. Just to try to even come up with one reason, one good thing the other party did. Criticizing your own party is very easy. That doesn't give you that's a cop-out. You can't be like, oh, no, my own party is bad. No, try to think of a good thing about the other party. That is hard. Because I've surveyed people where I'll say, can you criticize your own party? And they say, oh, happily. They'll write paragraphs about it. But then if I say, okay, well, what's one good thing about the other party? Nothing. They'll say nothing. I hate them. In fact, it makes them, in post-treatment partisan measures, it makes them like their own party even more when you ask them to criticize the other party. So negativity is driving affective polarization, and it makes us lose our ability to think even-handedly about issues. If there's one reason to try to stay as even-handed as you can, it's to maintain your own independence over your political thoughts. Partisanship is very difficult to bridge, unfortunately. It can happen, as I said, Matt Lewandowski has found the American identity can, in some circumstances, link partisans, although other people find that might not necessarily be true anymore. But that is a difficult concept in American politics. So what did we find in the 2024 election? Independents had incredibly high turnout. The independent voter came out and voted, and this really runs contrary to a lot of early work on independence, which suggests that independents are kind of like disengaged and don't know anything and don't care. That is not the independent voter of today. The independent voter today is highly engaged, and in fact are probably engaged partisans who just don't want to associate with their party anymore. Turnout, again, the numbers are still preliminary because many votes haven't been counted and we're still trying to figure out what exactly happened. Right now, it looks like independents voted at about the same rate as everybody else, which is pretty new. That's a fairly new phenomenon in American politics. 30 years ago, independents were voting at lower rates, largely because independents back then possibly were disengaged voters. Now independents are highly engaged voters who are so turned off by partisan politics, they no longer want to identify. So I would say independents are not disengaged, we know that. Possibly the Democrats didn't stand a chance in the election. If we want to talk about why they lost, this graph is hard to see, but maybe you've seen this before. Every single governing party facing an election in a developed country this year lost. So it is this, and apparently every party that has been in power since March 2022 has lost, suggesting that possibly post-COVID inflation just doomed every party in power, and the Democrats maybe never stood a chance at all. I wanted to show this, and I promise I'll zoom in. I was just told, though, that Utah, okay, so this is showing you the trend in every single state from 2020 to 2024. If a state has a right arrow, that means that overall the state supported Trump more than it did in 2020. If it has a blue arrow, it means it supported Trump less. There is only one state on this graph that turned blue. Congratulations, Washington, you did it. Oh, though I've heard Utah. You said Utah too. Well, but maybe Utah's actually not in this
was
graph.
this based on Trump vote or
this is Trump vote.
Yeah.
So, to my knowledge, Washington is the only one. So you guys are a special unicorn in a country where every single other state was really trying to penalize the incumbent party. Normally, I don't have such tailored state data for talks, but Trump won every single swing state. 7 for 7. And you know, when I teach a class on polling, and we spent a lot of time looking at the swing states, and I said to my students, it is possible that every swing state will be won narrowly, but by the same person. And then it's going to look like a blowout, but it's not really a blowout because it's a tiny win in every state. I didn't think that was actually going to happen. I was just saying it was possible, and it did happen. Trump won every single swing state, and it looks as though, because another talk I could have given was like, is polling okay? I think polling did great. In fact, one of my neighbors said, so what do you think of what happened in the election? And I was like, do you mean like for the pollsters? And they were like, no, for the candidates. And I was like, oh. I got really caught up in how well the pollsters did. The pollsters did great. I mean, every swing state was predicted to be within the margin of error. Every swing state was within the margin of error. It's just that Trump won every single one, so that happens sometimes. It looks as though every single group moved to the right, except for highly educated white men. So I'm going to show you, zoom in on the bottom there. This is every single group. So it's really older white voters, educated men, and highly educated voters. Those are the only ones where we see a leftward shift. And I do think the Trump-Harris headline has masked other very important electoral outcomes that are not being discussed. Do we need grand theories for how Democrats should change? I don't know. I don't know if we do. The Democrats did very well at the state level. They won 4 out of 5 Senate races in swing states, all of which voted for Trump. We saw a lot of very close House races where Democrats really overperformed. Demographic shifts across the states are going to be a challenge for the Democratic Party, regardless of how they're changing their message. And if you are a Democrat or want Democrats to win, this is the scariest graph I'm ever going to show you. This is the 2030 apportionment forecast from the U.S. Census. So every 10 years, if you don't know this, you don't follow census stuff, every 10 years we have a census, and the census data switches around the number of electoral votes that the states have depending on the population of those states. So I know, I'm sorry for anyone who interprets this as bad news. Congratulations if you think it's good news. Texas is gaining 4. This is estimates. Texas is gaining 4. Florida is gaining 3. California is losing 4. Those are kind of the big tickets. So the electoral votes alone are going to make it really hard for the Democrats over the next several years, unless we could have new swing states. I mean, we were talking about how when I was a child at dinner last night, we were talking about the swing states were Ohio, Iowa, New Hampshire, Florida. Those I still think of those as swing states. It's like the swing states you grew up with. You always think of them as the swing states. Swing states change. Texas has a good chance of becoming a swing state, I would say, in 5 or 10 years, maybe 10 years. Florida's never probably going to be a swing state again. Arizona's a swing state and will remain that way. So is this bad for the Democrats? I don't know. Okay, the last thing I'll say, in 2024, we see both partisanship in terms of affective polarization driving party preferences, and we see independence. Independent voters participating, engaged. We see a big penalty for the incumbent party based largely on a distrust of institutions and a distrust of government. But we also see a lot of split ticket voting and a rise of being able to separate that federal race from the state level ones. So I'm going to end there and open it up for questions if everybody has any or any comments. I'm happy to hear.
So we have 10 minutes or so for some Q&A.
I'll start off if no one else has one.
Oh, sure.
So because of the independents, they were very engaged.
Yeah.
And given your theory about partisan identity and how you overcome that, the Democratic appeal to country over party and reaching out to Adam Kinzinger and Cheney and that should have swayed the independent voters, but it didn't because they went I think 2 to 1 to Trump.
It looks like they voted Trump. I don't know for sure. I'm still trying to figure out how they voted. It does look like independents voted for Trump. However, one thing you might want to think about is we may have a large percentage of independents who are Republicans identifying as independents. That's what makes independents so tricky. It's why independent candidates never can win. Independents are such an ideologically divisive group. We have Democrats who call themselves independents, and we have Republicans who call themselves independents. So when somebody says, well, if I'm an independent candidate, why am I not winning 40% of the vote? Because that's an ideologically split group right there. So it's possible that in this particular election year, more and more right-leaning people are identifying as independent, and you can see why. Jan and I have one study in the book where we show after a party does something kind of embarrassing, its partisans become much more likely to identify as independent. So the bias in independence towards Democrats and Republicans is a little thermostatic. So it's possible that there's just more Republicans who are independents right now than Democrats, that Democrats feel less apprehensive in publicly identifying as a Democrat relative to Republicans, possibly especially younger Republicans who may feel the need to identify as independents at higher rates. It's also possible that independents wanted to penalize the incumbent party as much as anybody, and Cheney and whatever weren't going to change that. But yeah, we'll see. Yeah.
I was curious if there were any other variables that were related to outpartisan animosity.
Oh yeah, sure. We really don't find anything. So people who are really hostile toward the out party, demographically they look about the same. It's not like older people or younger people. We don't see any demographic differences. People who are hostile toward the out party do tend to be more engaged with politics in terms of reading the news and claiming that they want to read about it, they want to learn about it. So there is engagement, and we do control for engagement just to ensure that that's not what's driving our results. But demographically, no.
Attitudinally, though? Were there any other, I guess, ideologically, or I'll ask this question.
No, so the only difference we find is that people who are really high in affective polarization are attitudinally different, but only when issues are polarized.
Okay.
When issues are not sort of being politicized at a national level, their attitudes look exactly the same. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Should I field my own questions?
Yes, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Go ahead.
So thank you for the presentation. I have a comment and a question. So last week we had a three panelists trying to predict the outcome of the elections.
They didn't do very well.
No.
Yeah,
It's hard.
one the best prediction was like the name of the next president by one of the panelists, and even in that case, we saw that the popular vote prediction was not correct. So Trump
Yeah.
also winning the popular vote
Yeah.
in that case. So because I mean his victory is huge by like many dimensions, I guess, because he won, as you said, like all 7 swing states. And I think my comment in that case would be we need probably criticize and question to what extent those surveys, regional or national, they are. I mean,
Yeah.
I would especially use maybe the term reliability of those surveys and polls because they are so misleading as it happened in these elections too. But my question is more about the public image of those potential candidates. And when I say public image, I mean to appeal to potential voters, a candidate needs to project an image of strength and capability to address the problems of a nation. So to what extent do you think like Democrats, or especially influential people who endorsed Kamala Harris in this election, they cared about her public image as a leader? Because you know you can lead, you can be a boss of a small shop, a medium or a large enterprise. You can be the president of a school like this one, but nothing can be compared to leading a nation. When people see you, they need to trust in your power, in your strength, in your capability as a leader. So, what is your thought on
Sure.
this?
So great. So first on the question of the polls, you know, so in 2016 is always remembered as being like this horrible year for polls. And I'm very involved in the American Association for Public Opinion Research. So this is very near and dear to me. 2016 was actually an amazing year for polls if you looked at the national popular vote. The 2016 polls predicted the national popular vote almost exactly. I think they presented on average a 3% win for Clinton, and she won by 2%. However, in 2016, the polls really neglected swing states in a lot of pretty bad ways, especially Wisconsin, Ohio, and Michigan, where, so I think it was Wisconsin, Ohio, and Michigan were the 3 problems, where they weren't weighting properly, and the state level polls were so off, and even though 2016 predicted the national popular vote, they did a terrible job at predicting the electoral college. So I think in response to that in 2024, the pollsters really overcorrected to a certain extent, I guess you could say, where the emphasis was almost entirely on swing states. There was very little polling done actually outside of swing states, and relatively little polling done at the national popular level because the goal became predict the winner. Now, because there was so much focus on swing states, I think we now have a bit of an opposite problem, where pollsters did excellent at predicting what the swing states would be, which is in and of itself a difficult polling task, and what the margin of error would be. There was not as much attention paid to states like Florida, for example, where Trump really did very well and racked up his national popular vote win. So I think the polls this year were probably better when it comes to swing states, obviously worse when it comes to the national popular vote, and there needs to be some middle ground there. But we also see that in states where Harris was campaigning, she did very well relative to the states where she wasn't campaigning, and she spent most of her time campaigning in swing states. So on average, non-swing states swung almost 7 percentage points to Trump, whereas swing states swung only 3 percentage points to Trump. So it does look as though like there was an effect there of her campaigning in the swing states. I agree that being a strong leader in this particular election was a really important part of sort of the popular message. And if you look at the Senate candidates that overperformed Harris, the Democrats, they were very moderate, tough, sort of like strongman-y kind of candidates. In Arizona, our Senate candidate, Ruben Gallego, who's a Democrat, overperformed Harris and won the state of Arizona. Gallego's a veteran. He's tough on the border. He's always at the border. He's kind of like this big, strong dude. People like him. I agree that that is what people were looking for, it seems, in this sort of anti-incumbent election, where the border was a huge issue, the economy was a huge issue, and that probably didn't help. Yes, I'm gonna go right here because I know your hand's back, then we can go back. Yeah.
Looking at your cross-party gender perceptions,
Yeah.
which I found your findings absolutely fascinating there. Would you say, or would you conclude that future women candidates should avoid emphasizing these gender issues, or maybe even deliberately shy away from them and avoid them altogether?
Yeah, after the Hillary Clinton loss, that was definitely my impression that she had possibly overemphasized it, whereas Obama was very muted in talking about race. And Harris really didn't talk about either. I mean, Harris almost never mentioned her gender. And when asked about it, she would be very uncomfortable, almost like trying to move on as quickly as possible. So I think that was a strategy. She obviously read my paper. I think we can all agree. She tried not to emphasize gender. And it does seem like that's a good strategy, frankly, because a lot of these identities are not relatable to people from the other party. For a woman Democrat to say, Republican women, I'm a woman too, that is not the same thing for them. I mean, in fact, if anything, it only highlights possible disagreements. So I think probably, I don't know if she could have done it less, but I think if she had done it more, it wouldn't have helped.
Would you say the emphasis on the reproductive rights sort of did indirectly bring that identity out, though?
It may have, and it may have helped her. You know, it's interesting because a significant portion of Republicans oppose abortion bans and support reproductive rights. Not necessarily to the same extent that Democrats do. It's a very nuanced issue, obviously. It's not like a binary option. But in Arizona, for example, where Trump won, abortion was on the ballot and it passed with almost 70%. So there was very high support for reproductive rights in the state of Arizona. Now, by having it on the ballot, it could have helped Harris a bit. It may have. It also may have helped Trump because it allowed pro-choice Republicans to support Trump and to support reproductive rights without having to sort of channel their support for reproductive rights through their presidential candidate. Generally, we found, for example, in the 2022 midterms, having abortion on the ballot helps Democratic candidates. It's hard to know. We don't have the counterfactual if it helped or hurt Harris. I think it probably helps Democratic candidates in Arizona, but it did allow pro-choice Republicans, of which there are many, this option to support Trump and support abortion at the same time.
Just gonna wrap a second. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, did you have a question?
Just two quick ones, I hope. Turnout in this election, I seem to recall probably an MSNBC analysis suggesting Trump, in fact, turned out groups that didn't show up in prior elections significantly. But the second question is scapegoating. I quite frankly find utterly sort of appalling the kinds of arguments that went into scapegoating many comments. Could you comment on both of those and your sense of how they worked in this election?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there was so much discussion of immigrant groups, minority groups being attacked or denigrated, and it didn't seem to have that much of an effect in the turnout when we were looking at how groups were voting. So, for example, Puerto Rican voters, we know that a lot of these minority groups feel a lot of racial solidarity when it comes to voter. People who share the experience of discrimination do feel impacted when a similar group or another immigrant group is being discriminated against. But I agree, it's still puzzling to me, and we still don't have all the data on subgroups because the early exit polls are so unreliable. It looks as though Republicans did not face any backlash from that. And in fact, people were voting on the economy, that people were placing their blame on an incumbent party for high inflation rates above everything. Now, did it have no effect? I don't know. Maybe would he have won more without it? Possibly. It's hard to know what would happen in the parallel universe. I don't think it helped. I think it was probably ignored at best, but it certainly didn't hurt. That's what it seemed like.
I was actually thinking sort of the opposite. Trump, it seemed to me, made very much what I would call a Hitler-like argument in terms of economy. Who's to blame for economic problems? It is illegal immigrants. It is, and that they somehow poured over. And he made that repeatedly.
Yeah, I mean, those two issues, which you might think of as separate issues, became very tied together by the Trump Vance campaign, for sure. By saying the economy and the border are linked as one thing. If you're worried about one, you should be worried about the other. And they did allow the issues to sort of magnify each other by being one sort of overarching issue that had to do with scarcity and who's coming into our country and taking resources. So I totally see that link as well. I think it was probably pretty strategic on their part.
Okay, on that depressing note.
Oh yes, but everything's gonna be fine. Everything's gonna be fine.
Join me now in thanking Samara Klar for a really interesting conversation. Thank you for coming out.